It's wonderful being here after, I guess, 20 years since I graduated from the law school. When I was at the law school, I kept asking myself, is anything that I'm learning here going to be relevant to my future professional life? And I can now honestly say, nope. You know, they didn't teach technology, they didn't teach law, they didn't teach international, they didn't teach anything that I've done for the last 20 years. So anyway. Let's talk about the broader context of privacy for a few minutes. I think, I put some ideas up here. The way I see it, we're living through a transformative period where the world's information is going online, the world's information is searchable and findable, which means that 2,000 years of the concept of privacy has fundamentally changed. In privacy geek terms, we call that privacy by obscurity is dying, which means that we have to reinvent the concept of privacy so that it can be designed into software, designed into services, and reinvented for our world going forward. When I think about how people manage their digital identities, we are so at the starting point of what people will do in their everyday lives going forward. And what I want to do is share some controversies, some conflicts, some difficult problems that we faced at Google, and talk about the decisions that we made and how we drew the lines that we drew. We'll invite all of you to challenge me on that and to say, well, you would have drawn the line somewhere else. Just as sort of rules of our time here together, I'm going to do maybe 25 minutes of a little overview, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and discussion. And you can say anything you want, Why the focus on Google? When people are not talking about Facebook, they're talking about Google and privacy for a bunch of reasons, and they include the fact that we are trying to organize the world's information. If you try to organize the world's information, a lot of that information is going to be personal data, PII, if you will. And so a lot of that information will be stuff people don't want to be public. If you think about some of the services that we've launched, satellite views in Earth, street level views in Street View, all the kinds of platform technologies, things where people can store their own data, and now even a trial around health that we've just launched with the Cleveland Clinic. There's probably no more sensitive data category out there for most people than their personal health information. So in a sense, we've become a symbol for the internet, and in a lot of ways that's great, but in a lot of ways, of course, it's quite a burden to bear because we are not the internet. We're just a means for people to find information on the internet. So sometimes people say to me, you know too much, as a kind of slogan. By the way, that's never something anybody said to me when I was in law school here. So I'm actually kind of enjoy getting it now later in life, Just a few words on the legal context, because I'm based in Europe. And Europe has a very different legal context for privacy than the US, as I think you probably all know. In the US, it's sectoral regulation, health information or children's privacy or so on. It's a plethora of state laws that vary from state to state. There are, I think, 39 security breach regulations that vary across the different individual United States states. Europe, there's a horizontal privacy law that covers everything. It's just horizontal across all categories. If it's personal data, it's covered. And so by definition, it's written at a very high level of generality. And it's meant to define privacy as a human right, and then a lot of legal obligations that flow from that to try to protect it. That's one of the reasons that we have, I would say, some philosophical conflicts in the transatlantic privacy dialogue. That's a diplomatic speak. There are other regions of the world that are coming up with their own privacy regimes, like APEC, that is giving a lot of thought to it. And if I did a little timeline, privacy has quite a history. The OECD privacy guidelines were from 1980. And if you see the EU, which is the most detailed set of privacy regulations, the horizontal regime, was from 95. Both of those predated the internet, at least in ways that people could have predicted the privacy issues of the internet. And only now are people starting to step back and say, how do we need to update existing laws for the age of the internet? Or how do we need to reinvent an entirely new framework? What's really fascinating about this job and at Google and privacy on the internet and all of these issues is that we're always forced to be creative, right? We're forced to extrapolate from existing laws that might have been written to address things that didn't exist at the time the laws were written. So it gives us a chance to be creative, but because the internet moves so quickly, it gives us a chance to change as well. I'm going to give you some examples of what I think are probably the biggest controversies out there in the world of privacy and the internet today. This is my overview list, if you will. I'll dig into a few of them in some detail. Just very quickly, logs retention and how long should websites remember data in a world where you can remember everything forever. I'll say a few things about that. Talk about Street View and Earth, so images. Talk about ads, which is the economic lifeblood of all of these free Web 2.0 services, so it's pretty important. And how can you target in ways that still respect privacy? Talk about some recent acquisitions in this space and the consolidation of the industry, just very briefly. Maybe a little bit about Google's Open Social API, which is changing the data portability in social networking sites. And then if we have time, we can go into a few other things like the jurisdictional confusions of the cloud. First, just to level set on some things. It may be obvious to the techies, but most people aren't techies, so I just want to remind everybody, this is what websites collect. This is what Google collects when you do a search on Google. It's very similar for other websites as well. It's the IP address, it's a time and date stamp, it's the domain, here it's the query term, cars as an example, and then the technical information for display and the cookie ID number. So that's what we collect anytime somebody does a search on Google. It's the same for all the other search companies, and it's very similar for all other web companies in general. And the question is, how long should we retain this? How long should we remember it? Well, until recently, most websites remembered this indefinitely. And we thought that was too long, right? In privacy terms, shorter is better. Shorter is certainly better than forever. And a defined period was better. So our new policy, and we were the first in the industry to do that, was to anonymize after 18 months. I felt very strongly that it was important to have a finite period and to say, after 18 months, the logs get rewritten, and they look like that. So the cookie ID number is dropped, and the final octet of the IP address is dropped. It's not perfect anonymity in computer science terms, but it is very far down the road of anonymity. So for practical terms, people can't be identified. It's gone. It's out of our systems. We can't reverse engineer. And some people now have asked, the debate is really quite interesting to me, because when we did this, I thought, wow, this is probably the single biggest pro-privacy move that one company has done at one moment in time ever. Which I guess is a flip way of saying it was a big database before, true. But it was also a very dramatic statement, right? And in a world where this was not the practice on websites. And we're saying it ought to be the practice on websites. We ought to have finite periods for things, certainly in the unauthenticated form, where there's no password to get into databases. So when we launched this, there was a wave of excitement in the industry, and others in the industry followed our lead. Microsoft followed our lead. Yahoo announced 13 months, Microsoft 18. But the question now that is being debated is, why 18? 18 is better than indefinite, but 18 still seems kind of long. So why 18? And in fact, it's a balance between a number of different factors, and those factors are security-related, anti-fraud related, and also search quality improvement driven. And I can dig into some of those a little bit later, but I just want to go through the debates that we're seeing out there right now. Have any of you looked at Street View yourselves personally? Yeah, raise your hand if you. Yeah, okay, wow, everybody, excellent. Okay, so when I have sometimes in European audiences you get this very polite, and the Street View's only been launched in the U.S. so far. You'll notice that's a picture of Harvard Square, and the debate in Street View is, can you capture street-level images of all the buildings in a city? We just literally drive a van up and down the streets. And geolocate things. And what happens when there are individual faces? If there's a person that you can identify or a license plate that you can read in the image, isn't that a privacy violation? It's quite a debate. So we made a decision that in the public space, these are all images taken from public streets, things you could see walking down a public street in the US. It's legally acceptable, ethically acceptable, and people just think that's the right way to do it, to have this up there. If there's an identifiable image and somebody says, that's me, I want to be taken down, we have a takedown procedure. We've gotten very few requests for takedown. We've gotten a lot of sort of media debate around the set of issues, but it hasn't translated into an actual number of people saying, hey, that's me, and I don't want to be there. If it had been you walking down Harvard Square, and if the image was identifiable, how would you feel about it? Now, there are some cases, clearly, look, I'm the privacy guy, I worry about this sort of stuff. There are some cases where people were caught at times and places they didn't want to be caught. Yeah. You know, and I guess it wouldn't be Harvard Square in the middle of the afternoon, but there was one guy climbing a fence to get into a house. It was unclear whether that was his house, so we didn't know. There was also the famous legal principle is you can take images in public spaces, but don't photograph inside houses. Of course, we don't do that. I think there was only one image that caught someone that was behind the window and was visible through the image. Luckily, it turned out that was a cat, not a human being, who was on the windowsill. And that cat was interviewed by the New York Times about how it felt about the image. And the New York Times wasn't able to explain exactly how the cat felt about it. I was waiting for a takedown request from the cat, and if I had gotten it, I would have had the image taken down. But as it turns out, we didn't get that. So Earth is imagery taken, it's commercial satellite imagery that we put up and geolocate for the entire planet. On my Dick Cheney theme, that's the vice president's residence. And the reason I just put that up there right now is because, on Earth, our job is to have better and better resolution of more and more of the planet, right? Which is an amazing thing. It's a set of richness of information that was not available before. So with this, it does raise some questions, and the questions that it raises in my world are security and privacy related. Are there certain places that should not have the imagery up in high resolution because it might represent a security risk? This was not blurred by us, Google. It's how we got the images, but you can imagine why it was done. And similarly, it raises the question about, should people have a privacy right in property? In other words, if you're the owner of a house or a ranch or a farm or whatever, should you be able to say, that's mine, and I don't want it there. I don't want people to know I have a swimming pool in my backyard. I don't want people to just have this kind of information about me. And that's one of the debates that is being confronted right now. A lot of these debates are led in a sort of more, in the trade-offs between public and private, between freedom of expression and rights to obscurity. In the trade-offs between those things, we see different countries having the debates in different ways. So while the US has a tradition of almost unlimited ability to take imagery in public spaces, Europe has very much the opposite tradition. And it's something that we need to balance with these global services. Gmail, people probably use that themselves, or do some of you use Gmail? Yeah, wow, oh wow, okay. So obviously you don't think there's a privacy issue in Gmail, good. So, it's like, I don't either. I mean, I really don't either. Okay, that's a little bit of a joke. But I don't, so it is a contextual ad. It's an ad tied to a keyword that's in an email that's open on your screen at the moment that you open it. And I think in some ways that's a pretty clean and transparent privacy model. People understand that immediately. I mean, you just have to open an email and you see the connection to the ad. It's called the contextual model. It's a real-time connection to the content on your page. That's the traditional Google model for showing ads. And I contrast it with other models for showing ads in the world today, which are known as the behavioral models or the demographic models. So in the demographic model, a service will build a demographic profile about you and say things like where you live, zip code, how much money you make, male, female, rich, poor, what are your interests, things like that as demographic profile, and target against that permanently. Others will say it's all based on your behavior, meaning historical information. You went to a sports site yesterday, sports site the day before, and even though today you're on a travel site, we'll still show you ads for sports, right? That's like a behavioral model. This is the real-time model, the contextual model, which I think is the cleanest in privacy terms. But I'm not saying any of the three are bad. What I'm saying is you have to actually analyze the form of ad targeting to have a meaningful debate about the privacy implications. And they're very different models. The privacy questions of contextual, demographic, and behavioral are quite different. DoubleClick put the whole idea of third-party ad serving onto the public debate in a very visible way over the last few months. And we just got approval from the final competition authority to close our transaction. It was reviewed and approved by the US Federal Trade Commission, the European Commission, the Australian, and the Brazilian competition authorities. And all of them found no competition issues whatsoever in it. However, The debate about privacy will continue. But we were saying, and all of the competition authorities around the world who looked into this deal agreed with us, is that privacy is a separate analysis and a separate investigation from the competition or antitrust implications of an acquisition. If you look at a competition analysis, it should focus on competition. Does it increase or decrease competition? What's its impact on consumer welfare and so forth? The classic competition questions. Privacy is an entirely different set of questions. And so those questions continue. The questions about what is the appropriate way to target ads so that you don't violate people's sense of privacy. And as I said, since there are so many different models out there, it'll require a lot of analysis. So far, there have been a lot of slogans, but I think we need to step back. The Federal Trade Commission in Washington has led a very thorough attempt to get all the industry partners together, to get all the industry advocates and people who care about this topic to come together and say, what are the set of self-regulatory principles that ought to govern privacy in this space? A similar effort is going on in Europe. I hope that the two converge because we need one model around the world. We can't have competing models in Brussels and in Washington. And those sets of questions are focused on things like transparency to users. How can you be clear to a user how this works? What information is being collected and how is it used? How do you have a consent model for people so that they can say, yeah, I'm willing to get this kind of targeted ads, but not that kind? Or this set of practices is acceptable to me, but that is not. And how do you actually implement that? You can agree at the high level of the principles, but that's not sufficient, right? You have to agree at the high level of the principles, and you have to implement it into real-world technologies and services. So that's going to be very difficult. Everybody agrees you need adequate security. That's fairly obvious. And the other part of the discussion is, how do you have a separate and higher level of protection for sensitive personal data? And what does that mean? So for example, if you go into Google today and search on the words HIV, you'll see ads related to HIV, clinics, testing, research, whatever. That is not the collection of personally identifiable sensitive information. We show ads against it. But what if you were in a context where people were registered in, and in a social networking context, for example, somebody said, hey, my name's Jack, and I'm HIV positive. Could you show exactly the same ad that you could have showed the person on unauthenticated search? That's like the kinds of really difficult questions that you get into very quickly. And what happens if Jack goes from social networking to search and then back? So it becomes very intricate very quickly. In third-party ad serving, I just want to point out a couple facts. There's been a lot of discussion about size, as though it was all a question of the size of a database, which I think is actually wrong, because the question in my mind should be about the quality, not the quantity. In other words, what kind of data is it rather than how much of it? So in other words, the fundamental question in privacy terms has got to be, is the data personally identifiable or not? I mean, if something is anonymous, it can't raise a privacy question. That's almost logical, right? If we'll have discussion in just a couple minutes, when I say that, I'm glad to see people on the edge of their seat, because it's very easy to say, non-PII or PII, anonymous or personally identifiable, but in the real world, and that's what people in this room are going to be thinking about, certainly what I think about, is the gray zone between the two, right? That's the really hard cases, the gray zone between the two, where there are elements of identifiability without classic. You don't know exactly who it is, but you've got enough elements that perhaps there's some identifiability there. In social networking sites, the industry is doing a pretty good job of creating the ability to go private, put something up public or restrict it to particular users. Those are our examples, Orkut and Blogger. I don't know if you can read it from where you are, but I think you're probably all familiar with that. You're sophisticated users of these things. I think people really need to give some thought to using these privacy settings for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is because, everything that's out there publicly can be searchable, indexable, and used. And with our open social API, people will be able to plug into an API very easily to abstract pieces of the public social graph. Meaning, if I'm here and I have this set of friends over here, my Twitter friends, and I have this set of friends over here, my Orkut friends, I got this set of friends over here, and I may have different identities, if they point to each other in a social graph, that can be exported. In some privacy terms, that's wonderful, meaning because the user can suddenly be empowered to access their social graph in a way that it's not tied into one particular social network. So now we've got somebody else squirming in the room. But on the other hand, if you think about it this way, it also does raise questions about pointing to different parts of your digital identity, and those are going to be real privacy issues. We're sensitive to them. I mean, think about it. Like, let's say I'm over here, and this is my personal life, and I'm over here, and this is my work life, and I got pseudonyms in the two, and I didn't want the two to be combined. But if I'm pointing, or if my friends in my network are pointing to each other, it might suddenly become, linkable. And that's yet another reason for people to stop and think about what they want to make public about themselves. So, the idea of, dissidents or people who prefer to be gays and lesbians in the closet, or lots of reasons that people might have to have separate identities, it raises questions about how exactly do you want to maintain a non-aggregated vision of public information. So my best advice is don't put things out publicly if you don't want them to be aggregated. I'm going to skip through to a couple points about transparency and the ability to put out information. One of the, I think, best things that we can do as an industry is put out more information for consumers in simple and easy to understand language. One of the things that I learned is stop writing like lawyers, so like those contract things that you're being taught now, just forget it, because like nobody can read that, at least in our world. So we try to write things in simple, non-lawyerly, we call it Googly Language, and put out videos, because we know that people prefer to watch videos than to read legal text. I guess that's a real shocker for people to hear that one, which is one of the reasons that we're taping this, and we'll put it up on YouTube and some other things. The idea is we'll just put a lot of information out there. People can watch it, people can read it if they want or not. We're not going to force feed it to anybody. But for people who'd like to see it, would like to be part of the debate, would like to form their own views, there's more information out there than has ever been out there before. And we've got, I think, 20-odd videos that we've put out. Something like 250,000 people have watched them. I mean, these are really detailed, geeky videos, like a Google engineer talking about how we use cookies, I mean, it's not the juggling monkey and 2 million people on YouTube, So on web history, we've designed something so you can control all of your own information. I think this is a very good model. It's authenticated. You have to password and get in. But if you do, just like in Gmail, you can control the elements in your own history. You can delete things if you want, delete everything if you want. It's a way of creating user empowerment for their own information that I think is quite powerful. And I just want to close, because we need to be exactly on time today, with the cloud, and in particular with a group of lawyers, law students who are thinking about questions relating to jurisdiction, the ambiguities, the conflicts of laws, and all of those things. Well, the internet is so fascinating, right? Because it's taken every one of those problems and made it so much harder. Because all of these services suddenly become international immediately when you launch them. Anyone with a browser, anywhere on the planet can access your website. So does that mean every country that has someone who can access your website can suddenly claim jurisdiction over your service? Well, we're facing exactly that problem. Let me give you an example. The European data protection regulators have formally taken the position that, get this, if you use a cookie as a website, you are, quote, making use of equipment in the jurisdiction such to give them authority to apply data protection regulations to your service. So the traditional model of making use of equipment meant things like you had a factory, or a big office, a cookie. And since all websites essentially use cookies for all kinds of purposes, does that mean everything? It's this kind of debate, between trying to take these concepts from another age, reinvent them for the age of the internet, and then try to make sense of this. It's not about denying jurisdiction in all these other places. It's about finding a way for it all to work. I mean, in a world of 160 countries claiming jurisdiction and everybody wanting something a little bit different, in websites, one of the big challenges that we face in a very practical sense is coming up with a modus operandi that works. I like to think of it as a kind of common denominator. It might not make everybody exactly happy on every point, but I don't think we really have an alternative, because these things cannot balkanize into individual country-specific services. We don't even know. We don't even know where the users are very often, and they move around all the time. So if you take any of the topics that I talked about before, you could say we have to have essentially a common approach. And that common approach requires a lot of dialogue and goodwill, and it requires people to buy into the concept that jurisdiction on the internet and jurisdiction in the cloud is different. So, when people say to me, a classic privacy question, where is my data physically? I say it's in the cloud. And they don't like that sometimes because it sounds like it's an evasive answer. But the reality on the internet is it's the cloud. It's the combination of servers and data centers and proxy servers and routers and individual computers that are connected. It's all those places. And so it's very hard to answer the simple question, where is the data? And consequently, it's very hard to answer the jurisdictional questions as well. There's no simple solution to that. It's not going to be enough to say the location of the company offering the service. It's not going to be enough to say the location of the person accessing the service. It's going to have to be some common denominator. And so I'm spending a lot of time working with people to say, well, what should that common denominator be? And going forward, I think that debate is going to become one of the harshest because the internet is perceived by many people as undermining national sovereignty, undermining the ability for governments or politicians or regulators in country X to say, I get to decide how things happen in my country X. And in fact, well, we all have to give up a little so that the whole thing works.
We owe Peter Fleischer.